especially loneliness seems to have become more visible since COVID-19. How lonely exactly are we?
Unfortunately, we are very lonely across the world. This isn't just a Korean phenomenon. In the United States, 60% of nursing home residents don't have a single visitor at all. In the United Kingdom, 1 in 5 millennials doesn't have a single friend. 3 in 5 people in the UK, aged between 18 to 24, say that they are lonely often or always. So loneliness is a problem across the world. But what we've seen during, these are pre-COVID figures, but what we've seen during the pandemic has been increasing levels of loneliness across the world. A recent study done in February of 2021, for example, showed that 38% of Koreans are feeling lonely, always or often. Across the world, people are feeling lonelier, but Korea's actually, it turns out, one of the loneliest countries in the world right now, lonelier than the UK, the United States, Japan, and Singapore and China. Again, the crisis is global. So across the world, incredibly high numbers of people feel lonely. So Korea may be one of the loneliest, but others are pretty close. So just to be clear on that. But I think there's a number of factors at play that may speak to the Korean viewer and which they may recognize. The first is what we've seen really over the past few decades has been people do less with other people than in the past. So people are less likely to go to church. People are less likely to live with other people. Another factor is mass urbanization, people moving into cities from rural communities. But rural communities also feeling lonelier because residents there feeling left behind. Another factor for why this is the loneliest century and which may resonate with viewers in Korea is that loneliness isn't just about feeling that you're craving intimacy and connection with others. It's also about feeling that you're seen, heard, cared for. And what we've seen across the world, including in Korea, if I'm correct, has been growing inequality over the past few decades, with very significant numbers of people feeling, in economic terms, ignored, invisible, uncared for. Another factor is what we might think of as the neoliberal mindset. So neoliberal capitalism, the kind of capitalism that became dominant really from the 1980s onwards across the world, didn't only change our economic relations, it also changed the way we thought about each other and ourselves. We increasingly see ourselves as consumers rather than citizens, as hustlers rather than helpers, as takers rather than givers. Again, these are all attributes which inevitably lead to loneliness. The final reason why this is the loneliest century and why perhaps Korea is doing particularly badly on this front is, in a way, the downside of the incredible story of innovation and technological innovation that Korea has and can tell. But one of the things that has accelerated faster than elsewhere, although elsewhere is catching up, has been what we might think of as the rise of contactless living. So people ordering their food on delivery apps rather than going to a cafe, or doing their yoga classes on line rather than going to a yoga studio, or ordering their groceries rather than online rather than going to a shop. And, on the one hand, this is, of course, a much more convenient existence, much more frictionless. And yet, those micro exchanges that we have when we're in the cafe and we chat to the barista for 30 seconds, when we're in the grocery store and we chat to the cashier for a few seconds, when we go to the gym and we speak to the receptionist, those are moments that are actually really crucial to have in our day if we're going to feel more connected to others and less lonely. But more than that, these are also moments in our day when we traditionally practice the skills that underpin inclusive democracy, reciprocity, civility, thinking about others, not only ourselves. So my worry is that the allure of convenience could prove so strong that that's the direction as a society we move towards, increasingly contactless, but in the process, diminish how connected we feel to others, community, and even more so, inclusive democracy itself. When we think about loneliness, we often do think that it is likely to affect our mental health, and it does. Loneliness is associated with higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of depression, higher rates at the extreme, unfortunately, of suicide as well. But loneliness is also very bad for our physical health. If you're lonely, you have a 20% higher chance of having a heart attack or a stroke, and a 60% higher chance of developing dementia. If you're lonely, loneliness is worse for you than being obese, than not exercising, and in fact, as damaging for your physical health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. In many ways, it's the biggest public health crisis we're not talking about. Loneliness is also really bad for the economy for two reasons. First of all, because loneliness is a public health problem, it means that health budgets are being stretched because they're having to deal with the health consequences of loneliness. And this can come to billions of dollars a year in additional healthcare costs, but also because lonely workers are less productive, less motivated, less efficient, more likely to quit than workers who aren't. And then loneliness also threatens our political. Loneliness also threatens democracy itself. One of the reasons I started researching loneliness was because I was researching the rise of populism across the world, of leaders like Donald Trump in America or President Bolsonaro in Brazil. When a community feels lonely, we see a few things typically happen. One is the community or the individual is likely to become more insular. So kind of feel more hostile or threatened by outsiders, however they define them. We also know that loneliness is linked at a national level with increased rise in people's appetite for populist. What we know from the research is that loneliness can affect anyone of whatever age, but two groups tend to be lonelier than others. One is the elderly. So, elderly loneliness is a really serious problem, but it's actually the young who are the loneliest. And that might be surprising to some viewers, but the young are the loneliest generation. The research across the world is clear on this. And we really see this taking off, loneliness amongst young people taking off and then moving really in lockstep with social media usage and smartphone usage amongst the young. Nowadays, the adult in young people's lives often doesn't know. And then social media platforms are also places where we see incredibly high levels of abuse and bullying. In the United Kingdom, a third of young women aged between 18 to 24 have experienced abuse on Facebook, for example. 60% of college students in the UK have experienced cyberbullying. And of course, a world in which you're being abused or bullied is going to feel lonelier. And then there's the fact that it's very easy when you're looking at your social media to think that everyone else is more popular than you. I mean, this isn't just something that teenagers feel, we all feel it. And, of course, if you think everyone's more popular than you, in relative terms, you are going to feel lonely. So we are seeing this backlash, this tech backlash, emerging amongst some young people, and who are saying this is coming at a cost to our mental health. At the same time, of course, young people are. I'm not saying that young people are not using social media. Of course, they're using it in droves. But what we are starting to see is some young people actually saying, I'm deleting these apps off my phone. I am actually committing to interact more in person with others. There is a problem here. I don't want these platforms kind of shaping my experience and the way I interact and how I feel about myself. I don't want them to have this much power. So we are seeing that emerge. And at the same time, of course, we're seeing governments across the world, saying enough is enough. I think in many ways, social media companies are the tobacco companies of the 21st century and should be regulated as such. In the United Kingdom, there's a bill going through Parliament at the moment, the Online Safety Bill, which is going to impose very significant fines and even criminal penalties on social media companies if they're shown to create psychological harm, spread mass disinformation, etc. So we are seeing, across generations, including across the generation who are the most connected digitally, a growing backlash and a growing sense that there is a serious downside here. I mean, social media interaction is in many ways the fast food equivalent of communication. We eat a lot of it, but afterwards we don't feel good.
Yes, that's right. Would there be any more?
The global technology company Cisco, they have a scheme where anyone in the company, from the receptionist to the senior manager, can nominate anyone else who's been kind or helpful or collaborative, and that person gets a cash reward of maybe a couple of $100, maybe as much as a few $1,000s. And this is a company really saying, we value such qualities and we want our staff to exhibit them, and we're going to put our money where our mouth is. I think it's a fantastic scheme. Another thing, of course, that employers can think about and try and do is free up time for their employees so that they have more time to care for people outside of work, to care for their elderly parents, to care for their children, to care for their neighbors, to care for their friends. One of the problems of contemporary life is that many of us work incredibly long hours. Really, really important during this period is to protect our local shops, our local cafes, our local gyms. These places play hugely important roles in nurturing and anchoring our communities and making us feel connected. So really important to consciously support them right now. That's another thing we can do. What I want to say with regards to loneliness, Korea is one of the loneliest countries in the world. It is in the midst of a loneliness crisis. But the good news is that there's so much we can do to fix it, so much that governments can do, so much that businesses can do, so much that you as individuals can do. This may be the lonely century, but it really doesn't have to be so. The future is in all of our hands.